by deadline?
Yes. After deadline was finished, Mark Blank asked me to write another mystery. He started on another mystery scenario, but didn't get very far. He just liked the idea of having the main character actually witness the murder and have to figure it out. So he asked me if I would like to write that. And I said, yeah, I like Deadline so much, I'd like to give it a try. And it was still before I was working for Infocom, except as a moonlighting job. I was able to, we had a small office then, and I was able to come into the office and do development work off hours. But then before I finished, I had left MIT and become full-time in Infocom, employee number 6, I think. It was fairly easy because the syntax was a lot like the homebrew programming language that we developed at MIT. In fact, that was an interpreted language, and all the important constructs of Zork implementation language were supported by the interpreter underneath, the MDL interpreter. So a lot of it was very familiar to me. It was, the learning curve involved really story writing and making scenarios and making alternate scenarios, sort of the whole bunch of skills that I hadn't used before. I had written considerable nonfiction. I was editor of my college newspaper, for example, and I did some technical writing at MIT, so I knew how to, make complete sentences. And I actually, I guess it was after Moonmist, I got a card that said, I'm a writer, from the Mystery Writers of America. I got a membership. That was fun. Well, the first one of those, the Tom Swiftian story, was cooked up as a strategic move for the company to try to widen the audience or the market by making, first of all, a story that's accessible to younger readers, and also older readers who just like easier puzzles. They like to get into the story and participate, even if they're not great puzzle solvers in the sense that we were. So I think there was also some impetus from my co-writer, Jim Lawrence, because he came to us. He lived in New Jersey. We were in Cambridge, Mass. He saw a column in the New York Review of Books, New York Times Review of Books, about Deadline, and it mentioned The Witness. And he came to Boston and contacted us about working with us under contract. He had been writing his whole life, more or less. He, at that time, he was white-haired the way I am now, or even more so. Looked like Santa Claus, sort of. Fascinating guy. And he had ghostwritten Tom Swift Jr. books and Nancy Drew Jr. books, whatever the series was being produced in the 40s and 50s. Plus, he was writing the storylines for comic strips that were currently being published, like James Bond. And he was just a really creative guy with writing adventurous fiction. And he convinced us it was a good thing to do to work with him. So that's really how the Tom Swift idea got gelled together. You know, we had an initial meeting where we talked about plot ideas, and then he worked out a sort of a skeleton story and wrote it down for me and mailed it to me. Then we would have phone conversations, and I would say, okay, let's make these changes, and then you go ahead and write like chapter 1, and I'll see how that goes. And we progressed that way with sending paper mail back and forth, of course, telephone calls and occasional meetings. We probably met face-to-face about 3 or 4 times during that, during developing Seastalker. There was a time, I like this story, when we got to like the last act of the story, where you, the brilliant young inventor, know what the threat is, you know what you have to work with, you know, your own inventions and the whatever's available there. You know the other characters. And then how do we devise a game strategy that's interesting but not too difficult to get you to the success at the end? And Jim and I worked on this probably a whole day in Cambridge. But I told him at the beginning, I feel like we have a big job in front of us, because we've set up all this elaborate storyline beforehand without really knowing how it's going to end. And Jim said, "Don't worry, Stu. I have gotten heroes out of much tougher situations than this in his other stories." So that made me feel really good. And together, I mean, he came up with some ideas about how to introduce 1 or 2 more elements that we needed to finish, and I worked on the game issues. Jim said that he had already been thinking about stories with multiple paths before he heard about Infocom in the Times. I don't remember seeing anything that he'd actually done in that style, but he seemed to know how to do it. His I don't know if it came from maybe writing comic strips that he couldn't really see the end of a story until he was more than halfway through it, or what it was in his background. But he seemed to adapt very well to the kind of story structure that we needed. I do remember Douglas Adams coming in to talk about the Hitchhiker's Guide, and in fact, I happened to be walking by the front door when he came in, and unescorted, and no one there to welcome him, and I had to ask who he was, and he told me, and I said, "Well, you probably want to go and talk to Joel or Mark or somebody." Of course, he was already, I think, a lot more like us in terms of his mindset, his style of storytelling, and it seemed easier for him to take his established scenario, The Hitchhiker's Guide, which had already been in radio and book form, and with a lot of input from Steve, turn it into a non-linear scenario. We did get a visit from the president of Simon & Schuster. They were kind of thinking they'd like to acquire Infocom before anybody else did. And so I think it was the president and the vice president who would be in charge of Infocom if it happened, flew to Cambridge, arrived in a limo, took 3 of us to lunch in the limo. And that was impressive, but that was all that impressed me about them. I didn't think they really knew what we were about. They were publishers, mass market publishers. I said it to in fact, Albert came and asked me, I think he asked a lot of other people, what we thought about cutting a deal with, an acquisition with Simon & Schuster. And I said, well, personally, I don't want to work for the guy who would be in charge of us. I'd met him long enough to know that he didn't understand us. And so if that was going to be the outcome, I was against it. I don't really know what other people said, but I know the deal didn't come off.
Because it's easy to look at the financials. I mean,
well, perhaps part of the difficulty was that Simon was really only interested in the games part of the business, and already we were starting to develop a business product that they really didn't know anything about, not being into computers enough. So, that may have been a big factor too. I just don't recall. It would be surprising if there weren't a big change, because after the company got in dire straits and was acquired by Activision, the former board was not the board anymore. There was just whatever minimal number of directors was required by Massachusetts state law, and they were Activision people. And so if push came to shove, they would tell us what to do. And there was another big factor in the situation then, which was a change of management at Activision less than a year after we were acquired, where Jim Levy, who had been instrumental in wanting to acquire us, he was Activision's CEO and or president, he left. And the new management seemed to be, one of its goals seemed to be to prove that they could do better, that Jim had made mistakes and that they could correct them. So if Infocom was one of those mistakes, then they would be rigorous with us and make sure that what could have been a bad investment would turn out okay if they were in charge. So, yeah, I agree with the appearance of it, because it was almost inevitable.
So you actually...
At the very end, but yeah, May 3rd, 1989, it was announced that, quote, Infocom is moving to California, unquote. This is in a company meeting. And I remember letting out a laugh at that saying, because I knew it was impossible to move the concept of Infocom anywhere else. But yeah, that's when I was laid off.
So the natural...
I was, I'd been employed there for 6 years, and when I started job hunting after being laid off there, I think it became apparent that what I suspected is true, that my skills were not very marketable. It was kind of too late to go back to what I was doing at MIT, and what I had to do instead was to reinvent myself and start a new career. So when I was still employed at Infocom, I knew that. I had a feeling that would be true, and that if I went job hunting before being laid off, it would be difficult, and I didn't want to face it.
Was it just a case of?
We had some positive influence in helping people overcome anxiety of keyboards. When small computers started to become very popular in offices and homes, I think a lot of people didn't want to use them, even if they sort of had to because of their job. Students also in school who were just starting to be instructed in using computers. And I think that our kind of entertainment really made a difference in some cases, in either young people getting interested in working with computers or older people getting interested in tolerating computers. And it was I think it was significant. The first time that we went to the Consumer Electronics Show in the summer in Chicago, I was finishing work on Seastalker and working in our booth on the floor, got a chance to give a short demo for a group of school teachers who were there. And after just the shortest demo I've ever given, they said, "Oh, this is wonderful. This is just what our students need. It's on their level. They'll be interested. They'll learn from it." And I felt really good about that.
I have a couple teachers.
I think it shows, I feel good about it, for one thing, because it shows that the architecture we developed for making the games portable from one kind of computer to another is still viable. That you can, as long as you make the interpreter that runs on the new device, then the games run. Just like in 1984 when the Macintosh was announced. Even before it was announced, I think we developed the interpreter for the first Mac, and then almost immediately when it was announced to the public, we announced that we had 10 games available to run on the Mac. It was just that easy. And, that was like a majority of all games available. And I'm glad to hear that there may be new fans sprouting up that we don't even know about. Because it seemed, well, I guess it's hard to imagine that people today would be interested enough in an all-text game to really become a new fan at this time. There's so much else available, full of sound and fury, that's much more exciting for most people. And I'm really glad that there's a possible connection between folks like myself and much younger and new digital devices.
Okay.
It was at MIT, at the Lab for Computer Science, and it was, I'm not sure I saw Advent, but I did see Zork when it was the prequel to Zork. There was the implementers at that time, the 4 guys who worked on it at MIT, did a really small adventure with like 4 rooms, just to get the infrastructure in place, you know, the code base that would be used for real later on. And I think that was my first, either the prequel or the you know, the formative sort of alpha testing of the mainframe Zork. And I remember thinking, well, you know, this is kind of interesting, but I'm not that interested in Dungeons and Dragons, the scenario that it was based on, the universe. So I sort of, you know, followed their progress, and that was about it. But what really got me turned on was Deadline, after Infocom was formed, because I was actually one of the first playtesters of that, before I was employed at Infocom, when I was full-time at MIT. I got to use Infocom's first computer, a TRS-1 from Radio Shack, 2 floppy drives, as I remember, and I got to try out Deadline before it was really finished. But because the scenario was realistic, and it had, to me, a different feel from a vast dungeon with fantasy elements in it. That's when I fell in love with it, with the concept. The very first time I played Deadline, I, you know, went in the house, started looking around. I think I met someone, George probably, and then I was sort of snooping around the rooms. And then, about an hour into the story, the telephone rings. But I was nowhere near a telephone, so I missed the call. Someone else took it. Okay. The next time I played, I made sure to be near a telephone at that time. And I was able to, which was good because that was important in solving the case. I picked up the phone and heard, I think, George talking to somebody else. So that just blew my mind. I thought, this is, you know, I can relive this story over and over. And eventually, by looking at it from different angles and putting, you know, connecting the dots, then I could find out what's really going on, and that would be fun. That'd be satisfying. Yeah, we started with a grub stake of about $10,000, I think. Stock was $1 a share, and there were, I think, 10 charter shareholders. And I was also an officer from the beginning. I was Commonwealth of Massachusetts calls it the corporate clerk, but it's secretary in most other places, and treasurer at the beginning. So I kept track of the pennies that we were spending on equipment, you know, a modem and things like that we couldn't do without. To the best of my recollection, lawyers taught me to say that, I thought it would be a software development house that could succeed on a small scale, at least, just because the people involved, I knew the people involved so well. And, you know, I believed in their talent. I didn't picture myself working full-time for it. I thought it would be a moonlighting job for me. And, you know, I could do the officer thing anytime. But we really didn't have a good idea in the beginning, of what kind of products we wanted to make. It was 1979, you know, before the IBM PC was announced. There was only Radio Shack and Apple, I think. So our experience was with mainframe software. We didn't have that much expertise in making tiny programs for tiny computers. So we talked about various projects, document tracking in an insurance company, calculating nutritional content of foods and meals for somebody who had to keep track of that. And so in a sense, I was going along for the ride. I wanted to be in on whatever happened, if anything. It was the people. I believe we didn't have a written plan until we had an actual office and we were getting serious about developing games.